It is time for us to focus on a new brand, Meta. It is time for you to get inside your coon pod and just drink the bug juice that we're going to intravenously stuff into your veins. And it's going to be awesome because the future doesn't need you, but it's going to be great because we love you.
Why the future doesn't need us. I wanted to cover this document because it's one of the necessary documents to cover. And the irony is that while we're being prepared for this amazing supposed future, we're also being told that the future doesn't need us. And to understand what's going on, we also need to understand other similar essays that have come out over the years. You could class this as one of the global elite writings. And it's written by Bill Joy of Sun Microsystem. He begins by talking about his meeting that he had with Ray Kurzweil, and they had a discussion back in 2000 together with philosopher John Searle. And the discussion was about whether AI could become conscious. Now, the point of this video is not to discuss that. Personally, I don't believe that AI can be conscious unless you redefine what consciousness is to simply be a recording. There is no comparison between a programmed system and a self-conscious entity, a sentient being. The document says that, the essay says, this was printed in Wired magazine in 2000, that the future is definitely going to have to grapple with transhumanism. And at that time, the tech elite were already figuring out, what are we going to do with the fact that transhumanism is going to be the norm? Nanotechnology, GMOs, all of these things could present either a future of spiritual machines and utopia that Kurzweil talked about, or an amazing dystopia where there's a mass DEPOP. Bill Joy goes on to say in the very beginning that there will be an AI control grid that is erected, and within 3 pages, the most important section is where he says that there will be a large control system in the hands of a tiny tech elite. This elite will have control over the masses to an extent that we've never seen before in the history of the world. It goes on to say that the elite will essentially have to decide whether the masses are irrelevant, superfluous, or a useful burden that could be marshaled into some kind of a battery, right? Like the Matrix, where humans are just batteries for the Matrix. Whoa, right? No, that's not the future that we want. He says that this propaganda will be relentless until humanity reaches a point to where the elite will have to decide, do we want to exterminate or do we want to use them as kind of pets? That's literally what it says. If the humane response is decided, then there will be propaganda and other psychological and biological techniques to reduce birth rates, as well as motivating and moving humanity into a kind of peaceful, self-willed extinction. This will then allow the elite to go into the future, into a post-human future, it says. And thus, people could be coaxed into this by the means such as drugs, such as a Brave New World type of scenario where they're put into a kind of Metaverse scenario, where they're put into a kind of a virtual world and they just sort of drift off and they might be used for a while as batteries for the system, or in a humane, supposedly, way, gotten rid of. That's what the document says on page 3. He also says the other possibility is that people could undergo experimentation. There could be biological and psychologically engineered new types of humans. And this, of course, gets into the synthetic biology that we've talked about with the World Economic Forum in their books, particularly Klaus's book. But he says that ultimately the engineered human beings might be made happy in a society where they are not free. So perhaps a domesticated population under a kind of drug Brave New World scenario is the best possible option according to the tech elite. And he says that people like MK Ultra victim Ted Theodore you-know-who was aware of this. Now, I'm not advocating or saying that anything that he said was correct, but he had become aware of this plan that the tech elite back in this time had already made the decision, according to Bill Joy, to go ahead with that plan. The document goes on to talk about a dystopian vision, and he gives his account and history of rising into the tech elite power structure. And he says that he read a lot of science fiction, and what a lot of the science fiction taught him was that we're going to have to grapple with the realities of nanotech, the realities of these kinds of self-replicating technologies, black goo type stuff. He cites a lot of science fiction none of which I'm saying is true, but I'm just saying that that's what he talks about and what he sees as the future. So remember, science fiction has been a huge player in predicting in terms of programming the future, right? Predictive programming and planning and warming people up to, it's just inevitable that a kind of Star Trek Global Federation future is inevitable. That's what must happen. And he talks about Moore's Law. He talks about, technology advancing at such a rapid rate. And that really eventually there's going to be the implementation of CHIP in the population. And it may not be an actual CHIP, it can be in the form of nano, right? That's what we've talked about from Ray Kurzweil's books. We covered both of those in the last couple of weeks. We covered it in the Silent Weapons document. These are all public essays and documents. He goes on to talk about the reality of genetic modification and what that can do from a warfare perspective and the possibilities of what could be done in a good perspective. Obviously, of course, they're not doing this for good reasons. And he says that the gray goo, the black goo, could be a kind of a threat for a nanotech threat for the future we have to watch out for. And he says that the laws of nature, the laws of evolution have pretty much determined that we're at this new cycle, this new phase of this Great Reset. Now, he doesn't mention Great Reset, but he's talking about the end of all civilization as it has been known to bring in the new civilization, the fourth industrial revolution type of civilization. That's the same thing Klaus writes about. The same thing that Bill Joy's talking about is the exact same thing that Klaus and the World Economic Forum are on board with. That's what the Great Reset is about. He then goes into discussing the history of the 20th century in terms of warfare and in terms of technology. He mentions Edward Teller. He mentions the types of things that Edward Teller was involved in: GEOENGINERENERING. He mentions the Baruch Plan in terms of the United Nations, which you heard me cover in the Quigley lectures. I covered that in detail. So in fact, what really Bill Joy is doing is backing up all the stuff that you heard me cover in the Quigley lectures. He's aware of that. Now, he doesn't mention Quigley, but he does mention the Star Wars Defense Initiative and that this is ultimately tying into this plan to bring in the technocracy and to do the massive depop. He says that scientism has become the new god of our society. And because, of course, he is not coming from a religious perspective, he actually freaks out and says, we got to find some kind of moral, some kind of religious something that can ground people, that we don't go into this kind of a world. So he's kind of freaking out. He's kind of writing this essay like he doesn't know how we're going to navigate this new territory without any kind of morals. And then he mentions a really curious couple characters. He mentions Jack Parsons's JPL lab. It's a curious element to mention. And then he mentions Jacques Attali. Now, you've heard me cover Jacques Attali in multiple talks. We covered his Brief History of the Future as one of the key elite texts. We went through and lectured through that whole book. And he says that he met and talked to a lot with Jacques Attali, so this confirms that that is one of the key thinkers in terms of this new order. And we remember in Brief History of the Future, Jacques Attali said that the transhumanists are the tip of the spear for this coming new age. He says that when he met and talked with Attali, he couldn't find any kind of new moral, new religious paradigm that would work, because if we don't have an ethic behind what biotech is going to do, it will mean the end of the species. He says maybe we could talk to the Dalai Lama, maybe we could, which is ridiculous, right? The Sphinx from Mystery Men. I mean, come on. The Dalai Lama is not going to give you any kind of new, real moral, ethical imperative or paradigm by which to judge things. In fact, that's part of the system itself. And so he really ends up with no clear answers. Even he, as a man of worldly wisdom and worldly education from all vectors, recognizes that the future that we're going into is one that is totally nihilistic. Another way to remember to fight this type of a thing is to fight the bio food war that's out there. And that's why you want to be arming yourself, right? You want to have the right diet. You want to not be eating all of these horrible junky things. You want to not be eating synthetic fake foods. You want to not be eating fast foods. You want to have a healthy, traditional, organic type of diet